it's all on the table. I'm a believer in cross-examination as a way of getting to the truth. There's a reason Socrates did it. There's a reason courts do it. And here you had the most powerful people, the people at the very heart of this situation, put under the lens of cross-examination by adverse parties like the Justice Center, who wanted to show that they didn't need to do what they did. And that's there for everyone to see.
You're listening to the Corbett Report.
Welcome back, friends. Welcome back. James Corbett here, CorbettReport.com. It is December of 2022, December 5th in Canada, and December 6th here in Japan, to be precise, where I am going to be talking to two representatives of the JCCF, the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms, that I am sure my well-versed listeners will already know from my conversation back in February of 2021 with John Carpe on Canadian government delays mandatory traveler quarantine from the Solutions Watch series. If you don't recall that, you might want to check that out. The link will be in the show notes, as well as the link to jccf.ca, where you can learn more about the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms and what it is involved in these days. Today we're going to be talking to Rob Kittredge and Hatim Kheir of the JCCF. So first of all, guys, thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
All right, let's just start with some general background about yourselves, how you came to be involved with the JCCF, and what kind of work you do for them.
Sure. Well, the JCCF is a charitable organization that does Charter of Rights litigation, basically defending liberty of Canadians through litigation, which is kind of a rare thing for a charity to do. There's not many people doing the kind of work that we do. And we basically do civil liberties litigation pro bono for clients that we select based on, how much impact they would have on the rights of other Canadians and that sort of thing. I guess I'm a lawyer. I was called to the bar in 2007, and I've been an intellectual property lawyer for most of my career, but got a little tired of watching copyright get eaten away by secret trade treaties that made my work less and less pleasant as time went by, and the few statutes that I worked with, becoming less user-friendly. I had gotten into it as an open source kind of guy. So I was looking for a change in direction. And I had watched the Justice Center do a couple of cases that the Justice Center was involved with, and contacted them about a year and a half ago. And fortunately, they were hiring, and here we are.
Awesome. Rob, I should have you on to talk about IP at some point, but Hatim,
Sure.
How about yourself?
So I came from a criminal law background. I used to be a prosecutor. I left the government right around the time the vaccine mandates were coming in response to that. And I basically found the JCCF almost I just figured someone must be doing this work. So I kind of had it in the back of my head that, I'm sure there's lawyers on this. So I actually looked up who those lawyers were. I found the Justice Center, and I've been with them for a little bit over a year now.
Excellent. Well, it's good to have you guys here to talk about, I hope people understand what we're going to be talking about tonight. Of course, we're talking about the Public Order Emergency Commission, which just wrapped up its 31 days of hearings, and what a wild ride it has been. And I am sure there are some people in the audience who were paying close attention to it, and probably many who were not. But I think this is an incredibly important topic, not just for Canadians, although obviously for Canadians, but I think for people around the world who are concerned about what took place in Canada earlier this year with the extraordinary way that the Canadian government decided to deal with the Freedom Convoy protesters in Ottawa, Coutts, and other places around Canada. Absolutely insane what unfolded there. And so the Public Order Emergency Commission, as I did cover on New World Next Week a couple of weeks ago, so hopefully my audience is at least aware that, yes, Canada has been holding this commission to look into the invocation of the Emergencies Act, which was technically invoked for the first time there earlier this year, although it is related to the War Measures Act, which was invoked in World War I, World War II, and during the FLQ crisis in the 1970s. All of that to the side, let's get into this commission itself. Can you guys explain for myself and the benefit of the audience What is this commission? What is its remit? What kind of ruling is it going to make, and what really are its powers here?
Sure. Well, the Emergencies Act, when an emergency is declared, as one was February 14th of this year, the act itself requires that an inquiry be held into the circumstances that led to the declaration of emergency and the measures that were taken to deal with the emergency. So it's any government that invokes the act has to be prepared to deal with both a parliamentary, I'm not sure what the term is, committee review, and public inquiry. And we, during the protests in February, we had a number of lawyers on the ground. Hatim was in Ottawa at that time, and we were, providing legal advice and helping people navigate, helping the protesters navigate a very complicated situation. So when the time came for the inquiry, when the inquiry was called, we applied for standing to participate at the inquiry, which means that, it's not exactly a court proceeding and it's not exactly adversarial, like we're not exactly against Canada, but there were, I don't know, Hatim, about 25 parties?
Something like that in total, though a fewer number that were actually participating on a sort of day-to-day basis. Some were just there to make policy recommendations at the end of the day.
Right, and so there were a handful of civil liberties organizations. We shared our grant of standing with two other organizations, the Democracy Fund, which does work similar to what the JCCF does, and a group called Citizens for Freedom, who had been providing the same sort of assistance to protesters in Windsor at the border. And so we had one grant of standing that we shared with those other two groups. There was the organizers, the Convoy organizers, as they were called, had a grant of standing. So that was Tamara Leach and Tom Marazzo and Chris Barber and those people, the sort of principals that you've seen named and sent to jail repeatedly for outrageous periods of time on outrageous terms. But so they had standing. And apart from us, there were a couple of other civil liberties organizations that had a grant of standing. And then apart from us, it was the government of Canada there to defend its decision, and a whole bunch of police organizations. And so the chief of police in Ottawa at the time of the protests was Chief Slowly, who came under fire for his handling of the protests and wound up resigning in the middle of the protests and being replaced by a new interim chief. So he had representatives there. The Ontario Provincial Police had representatives there. That's the police force that polices across the province and in some smaller towns. The Ottawa Police Service had a grant of standing, and the RCMP was represented by Canada. And it really, about half of the work at the commission was different police forces pointing fingers at other police forces for who was to blame for this whole big mess. And then outside of that, it was the civil liberties organizations making the arguments about the emergency and whether it was legitimate. But quite a bit of time was chewed up with Peter Slowly pointing his finger at the Ottawa Police Service, the Ottawa Police Service pointing their finger at somebody else, the city councillors in Ottawa pointing their fingers at, somebody else. So it was an interesting mix of people in that way. And it seemed like a lot of the parties were there to serve individual interests or the interests of the organization that they served, where we and the other civil liberties organizations were just there to make the case that the invocation of the act was unlawful. So Yeah, I mean, it was I sort of forgot where the question started, but hopefully that's a bit of an overview.
I think it is, absolutely. And I will interject here that of course, there is a playlist of all of the JCCF's videos that you were releasing on a daily basis of your cross-examinations. And Hatim, I know you were doing a daily update of what was taking place at the commission. So, Hatim, from your perspective, what were some of the highlights or lowlights of the various things that we saw take place at this commission?
One of the big things that stood out to me was just how candid the police witnesses were about what happened and how little they needed the Emergencies Act. So one of the things that came out in the very first few weeks of the so I guess to take a step back, the commission kind of moved in a logical process from residents of Ottawa and Ottawa politicians and their complaints to the Ottawa Police and what they did with the situation, and the Ontario Provincial Police, eventually towards federal bureaucrats, and then right up to the Prime Minister himself. And so pretty early on, the facts on the ground got established. And, I think Rob would probably agree, we went into this expecting a big kind of fight against the police officers to establish that they could have done what they did in other ways, but they were all pretty candidly acknowledged that the emergency powers were useful but not necessary. We got a pretty discrete list of things they needed to do with the powers, and that all those things could have been replicated under other existing laws, which matters because the Emergencies Act has a few different tests that have to be met for its justification to be lawful. The two big ones are that there has to be a threat to the security of Canada, and that it has to rise to the level of a national emergency, meaning it can't be dealt with under any other laws of Canada. So that was kind of our big strategy going in, and that got taken care of by week 3, week 4. And then the rest of the time, we were able to focus on the different arguments that the federal officials were putting forward.
Right. And just to underline that, there was sort of the difference between the police representatives who were basically, as you say, admitting that these powers were not necessary, and the federal officials who were arguing that the emergency powers were necessary.
That's basically it. For the most part, the police really didn't want it invoked. They didn't need it. At the end of the day, there is some evidence. So there were a few powers that were created under the Emergencies Act. Basically, what declaring an emergency does is it allows the federal government to sort of have a temporary dictatorship where they can pass regulations that create powers that allow them to handle an emergency. So this would be used in a time of war or in some major natural disaster, where it would be impractical or impossible for government to proceed as normal and vote on a bill to provide relief to somebody or something like that. So the measures that were put in place under the Emergencies Act, some of the big ones, the powers that we talked about a lot, were strangely enough, this sort of became an inquiry into a national towing emergency. There were, and I wound up. Half of my cross-examinations focused on tow trucks. I was kind of the tow truck guy at the commission. But the point there was that, it just so happened that when the protests were sparked by vaccine mandates for truckers who are driving across the border. And, it just so happened when he pissed off a bunch of truckers, he pissed off a bunch of people who suddenly had a bunch of free time, can travel. And when they travel, they drive giant vehicles that are really impossible to move by ordinary means. You need a special heavy tow truck to move a semi truck. And when the protests got going, there was some difficulty finding towing services. Like some of the towing, the normal people that Ottawa used that they have standing contracts with, refused to tow. That may have been, there's differing reasons that are offered for that, but probably a big part of it was they're sort of allied with the protesters, as well as the fact that a lot of their business, if you're a heavy towing provider, a lot of your business comes from obviously semi-trucks and trucking companies. And if the trucking companies are protesting something, you don't necessarily want to side with the government and tow the trucks away. You might want to say no and preserve a business reputation or whatever. So one of the powers that was put in place with the emergencies regulations was the power to basically order tow truck drivers to provide services. And that came along with some provisions that made it easier for them to get paid. They were indemnified for any damage to their trucks and that kind of thing. They were provided with guarantees of anonymity, so they could cover up their business name with a sticker or something like that. And there are provisions in the emergencies regulations that make it so that freedom of information requests wouldn't turn up the information about who provided towing services, all of which, as it turned out, initially it looked like that power had never been used, but it turned out that the power was actually, or it seemed to have been used, but it was only used as a matter of convenience, because the tow trucks had already been lined up in Ottawa by the time the Emergencies Act was passed, or the emergency was declared. Sorry, and so the tow trucks were already there and ready to go, but there were these extra indemnities and powers and anonymity and stuff that was convenient to offer to them. So the act was used to, quote unquote, compel them to provide services, but they were already there and ready to provide services anyway. They would have towed the trucks with or without the invocation of the Emergencies Act. It just was handy to have indemnities that they could offer. It made it so the bill was paid by the federal government, I guess, or so, some streamlining of stuff like that. So it was a matter of convenience, not a matter of necessity. And we wound up talking a lot about tow trucks then, and I'm talking a lot about tow trucks now, which is probably a little boring. But that was one of the big powers. One of the other big powers was the power to create an exclusion zone while the police were clearing the protests. So to say you can't come into this area, unless you're here on official business or whatever. There isn't a general police power to exclude people from public spaces. There are common law powers that police can use and criminal code powers that police can use to keep people out of an area where they're conducting an operation, though. So if they were in the middle of clearing the protests, they could legitimately keep people from entering the protest area. So again, the Emergencies Act created an ability to declare a certain area to be off limits to everybody, and that was used, but it wasn't necessary. There were common law powers that they could have used to create that exclusion zone. So I guess those were two of the powers, and the police were quite open about the fact that they could have and would have cleared the protests with or without the invocation of the Emergencies Act. And actually, it was one of the. I'm not sure if you saw Inspector Morris of the OPP. He's the Ontario Provincial Police's intelligence czar, I guess. And he was the OPP in general was actually surprisingly seemed quite competent and pretty level-headed. He had a really fair perspective on who the protesters were. He basically puts together I don't know, for lack of a better word, an intelligence newsletter that gets circulated around the police agencies in Canada, talking about domestic issues that might become police matters. And he was talking about, the perception of the protesters, and he had quite a fair perception of them. And surprisingly, I'm not a big fan of cops in general, but if you're going to have a guy doing intelligence for a police force, you want that guy to be doing intelligence for the police force. He really painted a fair picture of who the protesters were, didn't fall for the whole terrorist, violent, extremist kind of narrative. And it was sort of refreshing to see that was going on behind the scenes, that somebody there's a voice of reason somewhere in the police force.
I'm glad that you provided all that perspective, including the tow truck perspective, because I can imagine some of my listeners going to look at your cross-examination of Prime Minister Trudeau and seeing that you spent most of the time talking about tow trucks. Why would you? Well, actually, it turns out this is quite an important issue when it comes to this.
Yeah, well, the other thing that happened in my cross-examination of Trudeau, and Hatim gets incredible credit for this. It was a real piece of work on his part. We had been having a fight about disclosures by the government of Canada. They would ordinarily have a right to keep cabinet documents and cabinet. We wouldn't ordinarily be able to ask them about what went on behind closed doors in cabinet because of a constitutional principle called cabinet confidence, and they would be able to resist disclosing any cabinet documents if they wanted to, but they partially waived that and disclosed quite a few documents, but they sort of kept what they wanted hidden. Disclosed, to be fair, they did disclose a large number of documents, some of which were helpful to us and didn't make the government look great. So it wasn't it wasn't fully transparent, but it was I was impressed at least that they revealed some documents. But anyway, there were arguments going on behind the scenes about redactions that Canada had made in its documents. And the night before Trudeau, they were disclosing piles of documents at the very last minute. The night before we'd cross-examine, someone would get 1,000 documents and, dumped on us that we'd have to review. And they had redacted blacked out some areas of the documents that we were disputing. And there was a motion to unredact certain documents. That was decided on the night before Trudeau's cross-examination. Justice Rouleau decided that Canada would have to disclose those documents unredacted. And Canada, that was at 10:30 at night. He ordered them disclosed at 11:30 at night. At 2:30 in the morning, we got an email from Canada that contained a bunch of the documents, but they had 3 documents that they were insisting needed to remain redacted. And they never made an argument as to why. And so in the morning, the commissioner ordered those documents released at 10:30. So that was an hour into Justin Trudeau's cross-examination. And I had a cross-examination scripted for him that was entirely different than what I wound up doing. Hatim went through the documents that were disclosed that morning and happened to find, just through some great lawyering or great detective work or whatever you want to call it, happened to find a page of one of the notes of one of the Prime Minister's office staffers that had a small redaction of just a couple of words that was marked as irrelevant. And so I asked Trudeau about tow trucks, and they would be relevant to our discussion today, wouldn't they? And Trudeau wouldn't have had any idea that I had this document, and he wouldn't have been able to be prepped for it. We made sure that we got up before lunch, so there was no break where he could have been informed of this, so it was a surprise. And I had him prepared a side-by-side comparison of the pages, and I asked him to look at the first redaction there, the one marked as irrelevant, and read to me what was redacted, and it was Americans providing tow trucks and providing tow trucks was what had been redacted as irrelevant. So it was an exciting cross, of the Prime Minister. We a little bit of drama that maybe you wouldn't have caught if you weren't deeply involved in the hearings. But it was a great catch by Hatim and a great opportunity to kind of kick Trudeau back on his heels a little bit. And it's a good thing, too, that I had to throw my cross-examination out, because as it turns out, he's not as dumb as he looks. So I was surprised to find him so well informed on the matters he was testifying about. It makes me wonder why we get this saccharine, empty, talking points Trudeau all the time. I think
almost like he's a drama teacher or something.
Imagine.
Yeah. No, I'm glad you pointed that out, because I watched your cross-examination, and I didn't really realize, of course, what you were doing is getting him to say that the tow trucks were relevant, and then pointing out the redaction says irrelevant. Yeah, of course, obviously. I feel stupid for not understanding your strategy there, but obviously that's brilliant. And Hatim, hats off to you for finding that and bringing that to Rob's attention. Hatim, maybe you can address that issue in general, the sort of the document dumps that were being done at odd hours, and the extensive redactions. Obviously, as Rob said, there's a lot of transparency, but not enough transparency, and the way that these documents were being released put undue stress, I can imagine, on the legal counsel.
Yeah, absolutely. So all the parties had an ongoing disclosure obligation, which meant if you have a document that you find that's relevant, you have to provide it. And so I guess to one perspective is that Canada was doing that. However, they were dumping hundreds of pages of documents the night before that witness that the documents would be relevant to would testify. So, for example, right before some of the ministers testified, we received several documents with lengthy documents with text messages from that minister. And it's the kind of thing that would be obviously relevant that would have had to have been obtained back in the summer when all this was happening. So it speaks to either, I mean, you can kind of take your pick, right? Is it incompetence? Is it deliberate? What the explanation is requires a bit of speculation, I guess. But for one reason or another, the government was releasing these documents only right before the parties would need to make use of those documents. And so, day after day of cross-examination, you're limited in your ability to actually then leverage the information you're finding in it. And then that's compounded by the fact that the documents were redacted, sometimes heavily redacted. There was quite an amusing moment on that last day when Trudeau was testifying, unplanned. So Rob scraps his cross-examination and does it on that issue of redactions. And then sure enough, the Canadian Constitution Foundation, who goes right after, shows the CSIS's threat assessment, which earlier Trudeau had said everyone should read. He advises us to read it for himself. And sure enough, it's just page after page of black square. So it got, I don't know if it picks up on the video, but it got a reaction from the crowd that was there in the room. And it just further put the nail on that point that these redactions were being used to hide or at least were hiding the substantive information, because Rob mentioned how the government had somewhat waived cabinet confidence, but there's kind of a danger there because it gives them a certain degree of selectivity. So they waived it with respect to the information that was coming into cabinet, but not with respect to the debates that cabinet was having. And then they also maintained privilege, solicitor-client privilege, applying to any sort of legal advice they were receiving. So with those kind of selective shrouds still up, there were a number of times where, a document would get to perhaps something important or interesting, and then it'd be hidden behind this cabinet confidence redaction, which from our perspective is kind of impossible to challenge, because you just say, well, no, we were talking about cabinet confidence, so no one else gets to see it. And then the solicitor-client privilege kind of highlighted a similar issue where if people were following this live, they would have realized that the week before all the federal ministers were testifying, it was coming out that CSIS had found that there was not a threat to the security of Canada as that's defined in the CSIS Act, and which is also imported into the Emergencies Act. And then on Monday, CSIS testifies, and it turns out that they actually advised the government to invoke the Emergencies Act anyways, despite finding that that standard wasn't met. And so under cross-examination by myself and the CCLA, it turns out that they were reassured, basically meaning they received legal advice about a certain way to interpret the acts that means the Emergencies Act has a broader understanding of that term from the CSIS Act. But then when pressed on that legal advice, which is kind of the linchpin to the whole argument, that's hidden by solicitor-client privilege. So it does create this very selective shield that the government can use when it gets down to brass tacks and the issues at hand.
Absolutely infuriating, isn't it?
I think with that, the selective waiver, if I was doing another one of these inquiries in the future, I think rather than just accepting, a partial waiver of cabinet confidence at face value, I think it would be really important to hammer down the terms of the waiver, because what it really wound up being was, we're going to waive cabinet confidence on the things that we choose to waive cabinet confidence on, and anything that we don't choose to waive cabinet confidence on, you have no way of challenging it. So I think if the government wants to have its cake and eat it too, in terms of transparency, they really should be required to make a solid commitment to particular rules of release. Like Hatim mentioned that they waived cabinet confidence with regard to the inputs to cabinet, so what people were telling cabinet, but we there were no hard and fast rules around that. So so lots of things were blacked out as cabinet confidence, and we don't know whether they were an input or a discussion or anything else. Some discussions were released. They released some stuff that wouldn't fall under inputs to cabinet. And it just wound up being, while I don't come down on this on the side that they weren't transparent at all, because, to be fair, they could have just refused to disclose anything. And, we are in a place where I'm optimistic about the results from the commission, and that's partially due to the fact that the government did disclose things. But they get to look more transparent than they actually probably were. Because if you look at that, the redaction that I put to Trudeau, it's obviously intentional. I mean, the words that were blacked out were offering tow trucks, and somebody went and drew a black square over offering tow trucks. Obviously intentional, and then they marked it irrelevant. Somebody somewhere was intentionally hiding relevant information. And who knows what the scope of that was. This isn't a normal court process where we would have, we would be able to stop things and say, wait a minute, let's do a motion to, force them to produce more documents, or they haven't produced them on time, let's hold things up. There's a very strict timetable at work here. It's a 1 year period of time that the commission has to work with, and that's a very, very tight timetable. So there's no real way to challenge this stuff. And we didn't even have hard and fast rules on transparency to begin with. So I live and learn, I guess. But
absolutely. Yeah, the idea of the selective transparency, where the entity in question, the government in this case, gets to choose what to be transparent about, obviously brings with it some very deep questions and problems. And in a way, it would, if they simply refused to disclose anything, that would be more incriminating, at least in the minds of the public. Oh, they won't show anything. But if they show a little bit here and there, then, hey, there's some sort of transparency. It's an interesting, yes, as you say, I think for any future commission to have any real credibility, I think that has to be hammered down before the commission even begins its work. But here we are, after the commission has wrapped up its hearings. Before we move on to your thoughts about what will come of this, one other thing I think we should stress about these hearings, it did not just involve police officials or government ministers. It also involved testimony from some of the Freedom Convoy protesters, some of the people affected by this. Do you have any thoughts on some of the testimony you heard during the commission from that perspective?
I thought we were incredibly... You couldn't ask for a cleaner set of facts in a situation like this. This was a major event with a ton of people. It was, to be fair, it was out of control. The police failed to do, basic policing to manage the protests, and they could have gone really badly. They, things could have gotten violent. Things could have been destroyed. But in 7 weeks of testimony, we got all we have in terms of, anything approaching violence are, third-hand anecdotal reports of, oh, my friend had somebody call her names or whatever, or somebody threw something at somebody. There was Hatim, maybe you can pipe up if I'm missing anything, but in terms of violence through the course of the protests all across Canada, there was a seizure of a bunch of guns in Coutts, Alberta. Some of the protesters or people at the protest in Coutts had a cache of weapons. And while they weren't used and they were, that matter was investigated by the RCMP using normal policing and not the Emergencies Act, and they were arrested under normal laws of Canada. That could have turned into something. Who knows what they were there for? There was, I guess, a police officer or a bylaw enforcement officer was sort of surrounded at one point in Ottawa by a bunch of, upset people or whatever. But really, I don't think there was really much else, Hatim. We've got anecdotal reports of my friend, told me that her friend, had some terrible comment made at her. But apart from those two things, that's really about as close to violence.
Right.
As
it was microaggressions and honking horns were apparently the threat to public order in Canada. Whereas on the other side, if you want to talk about harm to Canadians, you had testimony from people who were literally physically harmed by the officials that were trying to end these protests.
Well, and we had testimony from protesters who were arrested in downtown Ottawa. This was February in Ottawa, so minus, God knows what, who were arrested and driven out to the outskirts of town and left there with no working phone and having to walk or get themselves to somewhere where they could contact somebody to pick them up. Just catch and release sort of thing. Not
just to add to that, though, the deal was they don't contact their lawyer and they'll get released without charges and then released on the outskirts of town.
Yeah, but I think that the big takeaway from the protesters was that they did an amazing. It just so happened that Trudeau pissed off the wrong people who aren't easy to move, but it also happened that the people that came to the forefront of the protest, the prominent protesters, were quite reasonable people. They were encouraging everybody to be nonviolent. People were really, there were so many sort of, touch your heart kind of stories about people who had been, isolated for COVID for 2 years, who finally were in an environment where, they could interact with people and people bringing food, people, it really was, there were moments that were really heart-wrenching. Some of the stories of driving to Ottawa that Chris Barber told in particular were really touching. People just seeing this after 2 years of government overreach and feeling a spark of hope or whatever. And he says dismissively, but there were some real great moments and very few violent moments. And if you take a group of that size, any group of that size, a hockey game has more violence. Canada Day has more violence. There were people. It was a big party. But it was a really friendly party, apparently, because in 7 weeks of testimony, all the government could offer was a few third-hand reports of aggressive comments and this Coutts thing and the surrounding of the bylaw officer.
You're exactly right to point that out. Vancouver winning the Stanley Cup had way more violence than this massive protest threat to public order that requires the evocation of this Emergencies Act. Absolute nonsense. Really quite infuriating. And every Canadian should be offended by what took place. Deeply offended. Also, before the commission began, it was reported, and I did report on this, that there were questions about Justice Paul Rouleau's impartiality and perhaps his connections to the Liberal Party. Do you have any thoughts on Justice Rouleau and the way that he handled this commission?
Well, it's hard to get a read on the commissioner himself because, he does say a few things here and there. I think both of us were very impressed with commission counsel. So the way that the commission works is the commissioner is Justice Rouleau. and then there's a team of lawyers that basically work for the commission, and they're called commission counsel, and their role is to bring out the evidence that the commissioner needs to to make his findings. So they would be the first person to examine most of the witnesses, and they would if they examine somebody for 2 hours, then all the other parties would have 2 hours to split up amongst them to do their own cross-examinations. So we would get a few minutes sometimes, 20 minutes sometimes. But commission counsel was very fair. And at times, like, if you watch the commission counsel interviews of or examinations of the protesters, for example, they're not coming at it from a super biased standpoint. Our behind the scenes interactions with them have been very friendly and collegial, and there were a number of times where something would come up after we had done our cross-examination, and we would write to commission counsel and say, can you re-examine on this question? And they would do it. Some of the commission counsel, and I guess I won't name names because I don't want to, put a target on anyone, but some of them were very, I think some of them were on side and were very tough, did some tough examinations of some of the government witnesses in particular. You can look for a guy who points a lot with a pen did some great cross-examinations. But I thought that commission counsel was different. Counsel had different biases, and you could see it come out. There were some of them that were obviously friendly to the government. There were others of them that were, that were much more aggressive or trying to dig out, harder truths. Rouleau, I have nothing negative to say about the guy. I'm not looking at this like it is. I don't see it as a hugely biased hearing so far. We'll see what the results are. But I did notice towards the end, in the last week, when all of the ministers were about to be cross-examined, you did see a bit of a, he sort of was going out of his way to make the ministers comfortable and to make sure that, nothing circusy would happen, or, that the hearing room would be respectful and that sort of thing. And maybe went a little bit out of his way to, there's times when he can cut off a line of questioning, for example, and maybe he did that a little sooner than he would do it for some other witnesses. But I think that there's, a kind of an Occam's razor explanation for that, where I think that's just human. Judges are people too. He's got the prime minister showing up. He probably feels some responsibility to make the room, like at least not a super hostile place for them. And these are, I guess, big name people. And if you were having a party and the prime minister was coming over, you might be a little more concerned about cleaning up before he got there or something like that than you would be otherwise. So I'm cautiously optimistic that he's going to deliver a neutral or an unbiased assessment of the invocation of the Emergencies Act. But I'm open to being proven wrong. I've been disappointed before, and I'll be disappointed again. So,
Hatim, how about your thoughts?
Yeah, well, one of the good things about this process is that, to an extent, it almost, I'm not going to say it doesn't matter what his report is, because it is going to be influential. These things do tend to have a big impact in the way the Canadian government works. But all the evidence is out there. There were over 7,000, actually I think the last I heard was over 9,000 documents put into evidence, and those are on the website. Anyone can go and read through them themselves. There's thousands of hours, I'd assume, of video of every day of the inquiry, where people can watch the evidence come out as it came out in real time. And so the commissioner will make his findings, but the evidence is all there. Anyone who ever wants to show that no, there actually wasn't, these convoys weren't like what the media said they were, they can pull up the evidence of Inspector Pat Morris that Rob mentioned earlier, and they can say, look, go to the 4-hour mark, and you'll see him say, well, actually the media exacerbated the conflict by portraying this as something it wasn't. They can point to the cops who are saying they didn't need the powers when though they may have been helpful. And so all that is there for the public to see. And so I think that's the real power of this kind of a proceeding, that it's all on the table. I'm a believer in cross-examination as a way of getting to the truth. There's a reason Socrates did it. There's a reason courts do it. And here you had the most powerful people, the people at the very heart of this situation, put under the lens of cross-examination by adverse parties like the Justice Center, who wanted to show that they didn't need to do what they did, and that's there for everyone to see.
So the absolute bottom line here is that the evidence shows that there was that this did not meet the threshold for the criteria for invoking the Emergencies Act.
I would say that the government is advancing an argument that the threshold was met, but they've created a different threshold. So we had pretty modest goals for ourselves coming into this. We had hoped to put down an evidentiary record that showed that the provinces and the police had the powers that they needed without the invocation of the Emergencies Act. And just we expected to get a finding that that just rubber stamp the invocation, but we had hoped to have submissions of the Justice Center that established that the threshold wasn't really met. Surprisingly, we found ourselves in a place where it really looked like quite obviously the threshold wasn't met. There is an argument, like we're writing submissions right now, making our argument to the commissioner, that the invocation was unlawful. There is a counter argument that the government is going to put forward, which says that, the powers created under the Act were used. They were used for convenience, but they were used. And they're going to say that the way that you look at the definition of threat to the security of Canada in the CSIS Act is different than the way CSIS looks at it. And they can't point to, so the definition of threat to the security of Canada requires serious violence or the threats of serious violence. And they are making, among the arguments that they're making are, well, who knows what would have happened a day or two later if we didn't break it up that day? Would it have blown up? Would there have been bombs in the trucks? Would there have been, guns, and would somebody have died? So they're talking about, they're sort of trying to redefine the word threat of serious violence as like possibility of serious violence. We think that it requires more than that. I think, unfortunately, we've had an erosion of the meaning of the word violence, too, in the last, 5 years or so, where now, if I call you a jerk, that's violence. So it makes it possible for people to make some pretty outrageous arguments without getting laughed out of a room, saying that, feeling uncomfortable is violence or something like that. So, and unfortunately, that creep of destruction of the destruction of words to take a George Orwellism is it's creeping into courtrooms and into inquiries, and it's making it possible to make an argument that that making a bunch of people feel uncomfortable is serious violence. I hope that it's not found to be that. I hope the commissioner sees through that. But the government is making an argument that we have to counter. So I'm optimistic about the results, but I wouldn't go so far as to say it's obvious that we're going to get the finding that we want. It's obvious that we should. But.
Yeah, and yet Trudeau is just incensed at China for cracking down on the peaceful protesters in Beijing and around China. How could they do that, those monsters? Yeah. Interesting double standards.
in his testimony on the Friday, he said the idea that we should change public policy in response to protest is worrisome. And then 4 days later, he said that.
Yes, exactly right. I hope people will watch some of that cross-examination where he, again, it is on the record. As you say, at the very least, whatever comes of this, it is on the record. And people who are interested can go and pursue all of these documents. They can watch the testimonies. There's a lot of information that has come out of this. I guess just finally, my last question is, what is this commission actually, what does it have in its power to do? What kind of ruling will come down here? And does it have a power to enforce some sort of decision here?
Hatim, do you want to take that? I have a final question too, so I'll let Hatim take that.
Sure. So, I mean, in conducting the inquiry, commission has all sorts of powers to summon witnesses and require the production of evidence. In terms of the final report, it's just that, it's a report. So it doesn't have a legally binding effect. Though these kinds of inquiries happen in the course of the history of Canada's government, and they do generally tend to be taken quite seriously and influential. They have their influence. But at the end of the day, it's the force of its impact depends on it changing people's minds.
And I had a question for you, James. You watched Trudeau's testimony. What was your take on the Trudeau you saw on the stand versus the Trudeau that you see everywhere else?
My sense was that he was clearly more in a sort of lawyerly minded stance. It seemed to me that he was more approaching this from the perspective of the way that this is going to look in the terms of this proceedings, which obviously contradicts the way that he was speaking at the time of the events. And when he denied in Eva Chipiuk's, I believe, cross-examination, he denied, she read, and I think quite powerfully so, some of the testimony from some of the people affected by the mandates that the government was bringing in. He read it to his face and said that when the Prime Minister calls me a racist, misogynist, whatever, Nazi flag waver for daring to stick up for my rights, it profoundly affected me. And he pretended to be quite deeply affected by this, but I never called anyone any names, which of course people can see for themselves exactly the types of names that were being invoked and the way he tries to draw distinctions between that. So I think he was trying to put forward a more sort of legally something to do with the commission rather than what he would say, I think, to the general public on an evening news broadcast. Does that comport with your sense of his testimony?
I think, like I mentioned maybe in passing earlier, I was surprised that he is not as obtuse as he seems in media interviews and in question period and stuff like that. He's so focused on sound bites and saccharine statements, just I don't know, just tugging at heartstrings or whatever and trying to mask what's really going on. I was surprised that he was well informed about the matters that he was testifying about. It turns out that he's a smarter guy than I gave him credit for. It doesn't, I don't like him any more than I did when I started the whole thing. But he's not quite the person I thought he was.
That's my sense. He is capable of performing in different ways to different crowds depending on the context of where he's at. So. Yeah. Anyway, I am very much looking forward to this. What is the timeline on this? When will the ruling actually come?
It has to be tabled before Parliament on February 20th. That's the firm deadline.
So we will wait with bated breath in the meantime. I'm sure JCCF will be working on many, many other cases besides in the meantime, so people could keep up with that at jccf.ca. I'll put in that playlist of videos that the JCCF put out during the commission. Any other specific things that you'd like to link to for this interview that people should check out?
I would recommend that people check out the commission website. There are a bunch of what are called institutional reports that were put up, which are basically like, okay, so you're going to be cross-examining CSIS. Here's to save a bit of time. Here's a report on how CSIS works, or how the Prime Minister's office works, or how the Privy Council works. And some of them are really, quite a great civics lesson. I mean, the Prime Minister's Office and Privy Council one is really interesting. How Cabinet interacts with itself, how CSIS interacts with other intelligence agencies. There's lots of great information in there, that goes well beyond, that just is super informative about how our government works. And I found it to be a really great civics lesson just to be involved in this. You don't, as a lawyer, you don't necessarily think all that much about the inner workings of Parliament and the Privy Council. You're more dealing with the after the fact stuff in courts. But this was really eye-opening in a bunch of ways, seeing how the sausage gets made in a bunch of different ways was really informative. And I would highly recommend that people not only check out the evidence on the website or watch bits of the hearings, but read those institutional reports on organizations or government entities that they're interested in.
All right, Hatim, anything else you'd like to add?
No, I think we've covered it all. Just if anyone's curious, that's publicorderemergencycommission.ca.
Excellent. All right, we'll leave it there. The links will be in the show notes for this interview for people who are interested. And I hope that we'll be able to have you on perhaps again in the future once the actual report is tabled and we can discuss what came of all of this. Anyway, I do appreciate your guys' time tonight and for the work that you've done. I know it's been a crazy several weeks at that commission, so hats off to you for putting in that work. Thank you for doing what you do for the Canadians and people all around the world who are interested in freedom.
Thanks for having us on.
Thank you.